So continuing, I mentioned perhaps we could approach consciousness with a focus on the physical, and I said how physical objects always show this or that aspect or face to the eyes of a particular perceiver. And even if you don't want to go into the machinery of the subject, this from a point of viewness is latent. It's there in the manifestation of the object. Like I have this coffee cup on my desk right now. I'm seeing it from a certain angle. But I don't have to think about myself as a seer, right? If I were to take a photo, the photo would show one side of it and not another. So the way that objects manifest in terms of color and shape and space, even if you try to remove the subject as much as possible, this would be stubborn evidence of some notion of subjectivity. But I don't like the idea of the container subject, right? I think so much confusion comes from this deep metaphor. So it's the physical object, even in its barest, minimally theoretical manifestation, this object manifests in terms of aspects or facets or faces. So if I remember correctly, Locke, of course he noticed that when the perceiver is close to the object is larger relatively in what you might call the visual field. If you walk away from the object takes up less of the total visual field. But the thinking goes, the object has a true size. Surely the object has a true size, and that would be its tactile, pragmatic size, the size that you would care about most in your commerce with objects. So Mach makes a brilliant point in the analysis of sensations. We tend to say that a straight stick appears crooked if you immerse it in water. But as he points out, these are both experiences, the stick out of the water and the stick in the water. We decide that the stick is really straight for pragmatic reasons, and I think in this case it's because the tactile stick seems constant and is more important to us for many purposes. But you may have to adjust for the so-called illusion that is caused when you dip the stick in water. So we might ask, is there a deeper logical reason for this privileging of the tactile manifestation of the object? Now, the larger issue is, how did people come to think of the manifestation of the object as something inside the subject, right? You might say that from a point of viewness of the object, to use a visual term, was understood to imply the internality of that manifestation. And then you get something like a conception of consciousness as the stuff that those internal representations are made of. And this gives us the classic problem. All perception is now understood to give internal icons. But this basically means that experience itself is just a system of internal icons. So then you get the problem of the external world, which, in practical terms, is laughable, because I don't think anyone fails to believe in the external world for long. But I would strongly object to the idea that the shared world is external. Of course, it's not within the boundaries of my skin, right? But it's not external to my mind because I don't think the mind has an inside. That container metaphor is valuable in the context of keeping secrets or the inscrutability of intentions in some cases, but you might say that my ontology or philosophy is largely a critique of this unchallenged internal-external divide. Now, of course, it's not completely unchallenged. I think Heidegger's work, Mach's work, but in my view, I really want to zero in on this consciousness issue, to really try to explicate consciousness. For many, it's merely intelligent behavior. I feel like the issue gets diverted from what to me is the most interesting and elusive thing, which is the presence or the quality of the world. So there's a strong moment in Wittgenstein where he basically wonders at the very existence of the world. So I think it's connected to things like the principle of sufficient reason. You might say the brute fact of the world's presence. I can talk about things, I can try to explain things, because is the right word, but they're here, the here-ness of objects, which, I come to realize is from a point of view. Or you can say that I can come to philosophically thematize this from a point of viewness. And of course, philosophers have done this, but so many of them do it in terms of the internal and external dichotomy. They take this as something like the absolute fact, right? You can reason from this. This is itself obvious. And I think this is in Chalmers when people talk about the hard problem of consciousness. But what they're missing is the presence or the quality of the physical. So you might say that what they take for granted is some sort of omniscient narrator's view of the physical. And there are different ways to think about it. A lot of people they'll think about the scientific image, but the physical is understood to have this trivial, obvious kind of being, and yet 5 minutes later people will talk about our indirect access to the physical. So you have a bifurcation of the world. I believe that's the term that Whitehead used. William James is great on this issue. Of course, his essay, Does Consciousness Exist? He answers the question, no. Basically, a world of pure experience. This Pennon experientialism, I think it's very shrewd in that it sees these distinctions between internal and external. These are just practical distinctions imposed on experience as the stuff the world is made of. However, James, even though that's a useful first approximation, he goes on to say that, well, actually, experience is not the stuff that the world is made of. The world is made out of ice cream and concrete, the radical pluralism. So in my view, in this endorsement of radical pluralism, you have implicitly the ontological difference. Now, if someone just says experience is the stuff the world is made of, that's ingredient ontology, neutral monism. and it's a sophisticated position, and their use of experience, it's definitely a gesture in the direction of presence and quality. You might say in the direction of the for me manifestation of the world and the for you manifestation of the world. So it's implicit. Radical pluralism, and then the use of this word experience, that takes us right to the edge. So what I like about the ontological difference in Sartre, Heidegger, and Wittgenstein, each with their own version, this it secures the radical pluralism, but it also captures, zeroes in on what to me is a fundamental issue. So when people talk about qualia, I think what they want to say is presence, right? Because I suggest that presence is some synonym of quality. The smell of things, the sound of things. It's for me, it's hard to think of quality without presence. And this is why, even though the words kind of have a different feel, presence and quality both seem like synonyms to me of being, and then consciousness is another one of these synonyms. So you have consciousness, presence, quality, being. You might say the there-ness and the now-ness of the manifestation of the world. So from my point of view, let's say that I go looking for consciousness. I'm a skeptic, and I just walk around the world looking for consciousness, and I can't find it anywhere, right? And of course, the joke here, consciousness is the manifestness of the world that I'm searching. It is the being of that world, right? So to look for consciousness within the world, as an entity in the world, that would be to understand consciousness as a stuff. And here I agree with James and the eliminativist. Consciousness is not a thing. But now you could talk about operational consciousness. This is one of the confusing issues, right? There's a very pure notion of consciousness that you might call phenomenal consciousness. I've called it ontological consciousness. But this would be different from a kind of operational empirical concept of consciousness that people can invent and maybe have invented without maybe clarifying the issue. So ontological consciousness would just be, the presence, quality, or being of the physical. And we would say for the organism that it is associated with that ontological consciousness. You might say that they have that consciousness, but I think it's less confusing to say that that ontological consciousness has them, because that ontological consciousness is not internal, it's not a stuff, but the mere the presence of the world, the presence of the surrounding world, and then the presence of that flesh and blood subject for that flesh and blood subject. Maybe I search the world for the consciousness of the other. I find entities that I consider conscious. Do I find their consciousness? So I would say I find maybe their operational consciousness. I can explain why I attribute ontological consciousness to them. But this is where the two concepts meet. What I don't have is the world from their point of view. I don't see the world through their eyes. I don't smell the flower with their nose, right? So their consciousness, their ontological consciousness, is likewise not a thing in the world for me to find, right? You might say that it would be, from my point of view, the presence of the physical for them. which you might say I can never sort of directly verify. Now, because I think philosophy presupposes the forum, even though I can't sort of verify the consciousness of others in this ideal geometric theoretical sense, I don't doubt it, and it would be somewhat of a performative contradiction for me to talk with people and doubt their consciousness, and that would be a serious, life crisis if you somehow stopped believing that others had the same world that you have, right? That you might say that sharing the world in this crucial sense is the idea that the world is manifest for others in a way that is analogous to the way the world is manifest to you. So it occurs to me there's this famous question that, does the moon exist? How does the moon exist? Well, the way I would answer this, the moon as a kind of physical object, it would, my consciousness would be the being or the presence or the quality of the moon, as I see it from the woods when I walk at night, right? On a full moon, when the moon is full, there's a surprising amount of light. I can often just put my flashlight away. But when the moon is new, and you have all these intermediate stages, but I have what you might call the presence of the moon, a moment of the moon. And I understand other people in other places, whether I'm there or not, to also have access to this moon. Now, I would say that their consciousness of the moon is part of the moon's very being, but I'm not saying that the moon is in their head. So I think Mach and Avenarius, they already account for the causal relationships between the organism and the way the world manifests to that organism. So I completely accept those relationships. I don't think they imply indirect realism, and I see indirect realism as an idealistic theory, really. All it does is add on objects to the container subjects that it takes for granted, right? It assumes the subject is a container of representations. So I think for the indirect realist, they have to sort of trust that there's a real moon or some moon-like thing or just some X that generates internal icons of the moon, right? So this is one of the problems with a kind of materialistic representational realism, that the true objects are never accessed directly, so you have to infer. You might try to explain continuities in experience and social life in terms of these postulated true objects, which also function as truth makers. So, hardly the first time I've said this, but I think phenomenalism has tended to be misunderstood by indirect realists as a mere removal of the substrate from the framework. And to me, that's a serious misunderstanding. And Mill's use of sensation, I can understand that being misleading, but Mach, he went out of his way to use the word element, and he said it's neither mental nor physical in the old traditional sense. So from this point of view, from the point of view of my approach, the moon is a kind of unity of its ongoing manifestations, right, of its past manifestations, and this goes back to Husserl, what Harman makes of Husserl, that when I see the half moon above me, I recognize the same old moon, but I have a moment of the moon's manifestation. I am situated and I perceive the moon, and my consciousness is the being, quality, or presence of a moment or an aspect of the moon. But I understand the moon pre-theoretically as an object I share with others. So the moon is very much not inside of me. My consciousness of the moon is not an internal icon. Like, from my point of view, this pointlessly doubles the world, and it stuffs consciousness into the subject